It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the ASUS CG32UQ. As usual for a video review, what you see depends on my camera, it depends on the processing done by my video editing software, by YouTube, and ultimately it depends on the screen that you're viewing the video on. So in no way does it represent exactly what the monitor looks like firsthand. As usual, there is an accompanying written review, and you can find a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. The monitor uses a 31.5-inch 60Hz VA, that's vertical alignment panel, with a 3840 by 2160 4K UHD resolution. This screen size and resolution combination gives you an excellent pixel density, so the clarity is very good, the level of detail you see on suitably high resolution image content is very good, and on the desktop, as I am here, there's a really nice amount of desktop real estate. So you can do lots of multitasking if you like to do that. So you can view lots of information on web pages whilst also working on a Word document or whatever you might be doing. It's just some examples of what you could do. Or if you're just working on your document, you can have lots of information all at the same time. And the clarity of the text is very good, really good readability. And personally, I don't use any scaling on a screen of this size and resolution. I can use it with 100% scaling, so everything is just its normal size. I don't use any application-specific zoom. Some users might like to, according to their preferences, depending on their viewing distance, their eyesight, or just how they like things to look. But either way, you would get away with using a lower level of scaling if you do use that than you would on smaller models. And I also find the screen size nice and immersive. I tend to use the monitor from a viewing distance of around 70 centimeters, give or take a bit, depending on my posture and what I'm doing. But from that kind of viewing distance, I really do find this resolution really nice on a screen of this size, and the physical size itself nice for the immersion. This is, of course, a monitor marketed towards console gamers. CG at the start of the model number in fact denotes that. However, the reason for that is really because of the feature set. It's 4K capable, it has good HDR capabilities, and that's the kind of thing that really pushes modern games consoles to their limits and makes full use of their feature set. But of course, modern PCs, they share this because modern games consoles are basically just mid-range PCs. So although I'm using the PC as my system on this review, it'll give you an excellent idea of what to expect from a modern games console which supports all of the monitor's features. I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor. So as you can see, lots of matte black plastic, quite an interesting feature. On the stand base itself, there are two pads either side of it. These have a grippy texture. And the idea here is that you rest your wireless game controllers on this. And either side of the stand base, there's a little USB port which provides power, so you can plug them in. It has 5-volt capability, so it offers a decent rate of charge. And if you're not using game controllers, you could just perhaps put a smartphone there and charge it that way. There's no sort of wireless charging capability. They aren't Qi compatible pads or anything like that, but it does give you quite a convenient way to charge devices. And the USB ports there are powered through the stand neck into the monitor itself, so the monitor provides the power for that. You can see that there is a single stage bezel design, as I would call it. That means that the bezel itself is a moderately thick matte black plastic. I mean, it's not that thick, but compared to some designs, it's a bit thicker. It doesn't have a visible panel border, as some have. So some will have a very slender, hard outer component, and then they'll have a panel border which blends in when the screen's off, but you can see when the screen's on. And they tend to have a slimmer bezel overall if you count both components. Whereas this one, it has the physical bezel itself, the matte black bezel, completely covering the panel border, or there might be just a little bit of a sliver remaining, but it's really not very noticeable at all. The screen surface, matte anti-glare, so there's this large screen with a matte anti-glare screen surface. This is a medium, or depending on how you classify it, relatively light matte anti-glare screen surface. This is a bright room hue, and I just showed you at various angles, but even then the glare handling is rather good, so it does offer good glare handling characteristics. It also has a bit of an effect on the image, and that's explored elsewhere in the review. Another thing to note from the front, there's a little infrared receiver there, and a power LED which glows white when the monitor's on or orange when it's on standby. It enters a low power state, so a signal to the system's lost. If you prefer, you can disable that in the OSD so it's not always shining for you. But it does include a TV style remote here for intuitive navigation of the OSD, and I go through that in the OSD video. There are also controls at the rear of the monitor, which I'll show you shortly. Something I should note as well, the grippy texture is good in terms of things not slipping around. I actually use it to have the remote just resting there and it doesn't sort of slip around on the desk. Not that I generally kind of wobble my desk and expect things to slip around, but it's kind of a nice texture for just keeping things in place. However, it also does attract quite a bit of dirt and dust. You can probably see that. I'm not a particularly messy person, and I don't sort of like rub my face all over this or anything like that, but you can see that it is a little bit dirty looking. It's nothing that a clean microfiber cloth wouldn't fix, but it is harder to keep clean than, say, the rest of the plastic there, the matte black plastic, which you can just wipe dust off very easily. From the side, the screen is reasonably slender. It's not super slim, not particularly fat either. It lumps out centrally where the stand attaches. You can see the quite robust looking stand design there as well. And you can also see the USB port as it's located there, just for charging. There's also a strip of LEDs, a perimeter of LEDs, which form the RGB LED lighting feature of the monitor. That is or a halo or a sync or RGB, depending on how you're using it, and that's all explored in the OSD video. There's a strip at the back as well, and at the other side of the monitor. So there are lots of LEDs. It's an effective ambient lighting solution. And the stand isn't just robust because it is designed to sort of look solid and feel solid. It's also robust because it offers a bit of ergonomic flexibility to the monitor, so you can adjust the height of the screen. You can also tilt it backwards and forwards. You can't swivel it and you can't rotate it into portrait. So it rotates backwards a bit and forwards a little bit. And the exact measurements for the tilt angle and the height adjustment can be found in the written review in the features and aesthetics section. At the rear, you can see it's mainly matte black plastic. There are a few blue plastic elements, kind of a hexagonal ring around the stand attachment point for a little bit of visual interest in this kind of portal design, which is used to use on some of their things. There is also the OSD controls there, so that includes a blue joystick and 3 pressable buttons. Speaker grills, the speakers of this monitor, they're explored more in the written review. I don't tend to say too much about them in the video reviews, although I do think in this case they are worth a mention. They're good, powerful speakers, 2 12-watt speakers, and they produce the best sound output I've heard from a monitor. It's really a very deep, clear sound, good bassiness. That's just using the default settings. You can tweak the equalizer settings a little bit, and there are various different preset modes in the OSD. I think they call it Audio Wizard or something like that. But really just using the defaults, it gives a nice sound which is nice and full, nice and crisp, and it's enjoyable to just sort of watch Netflix videos on, listen to music, that kind of thing. It's all right for gaming as well, although you don't really get a great directionality because it's just a stereo system. It's not as good as a nice pair of headphones or anything like that, but it does work and it does give a good sound output quality. There's a Kensington lock slot as well, to the far right there. And the ports, they're down firing. They're located beneath this little cover, which you can snap off. And by snap off, I mean just sort of take it off. It's designed to be removed. You're not breaking the monitor or anything like that. So you just take it off very easily. And then you can see the ports. So there's a DC power input. The monitor has an external power brick. There are 3 HDMI 2 ports, plus DisplayPort 1.2a, and a 3.5mm headphone jack. All of the digital inputs here, the HDMI and DisplayPort, they support adaptive sync and they support HDR. NVIDIA G-Sync compatible mode is supported via DisplayPort only. That's not just on this monitor, it's on every monitor currently, whereas AMD FreeSync can be used either via DisplayPort or HDMI. And the full 60Hz at the native 3840 by 2160 is also supported by both of these input types. In the central region, there's a quick release button there, which you press to remove the stand from the monitor itself. Obviously, I don't want to do that right now. At the other side, there are some USB ports. The first one there is just designed for charging. You can charge anything that would support normal USB charging with that, but actually you can see there's a little icon there, and I think the icon is supposed to denote the alternative stand design. The alternative stand design is if you've got the screen attached with an alternative mount, so you don't have the screen attached to this stand, you can have an alternative stand neck attached, which allows you to use this as a headphone stand, and you can still make use of the power charging facilities, the USB power charging facility, if you've got a USB cable connected to the screen, because you're not having the screen connected through the stand neck, so you're not getting power through that, so you do need to have a separate connection to get power. And I will show you the alternative stand design shortly, just so it's a bit less confusing than me just talking about it and you wondering what the heck I'm talking about. There's a USB 3 upstream port and two USB 3 downstream ports, and these ones do supply data. If you're not using the included stand for the monitor because you're using the VESA mounting capabilities instead, you can use the stand base and this little stand neck, this alternative stand neck, which is included in the monitor box, as a sort of headphone stand. You can also attach a USB 3 upstream cable to power the stand, and that will give you access to the little USB ports. The USB ports being used for charging devices, and you'll see that the little bit that you put your headphones on, the little stand neck there, has a little slot at the bottom, which is where you'd feed the USB cable through to get the power to the stand base there. I'm now going to talk about the contrast performance of the monitor, and to start off I like to talk about something which is relevant to VA panels like this, and that is black crush. The perceived gamma on VA panels like this is different for the section of the screen you're viewing directly, or in this case that the camera is directly pointed at, versus areas peripherally, so further out. If you're sitting at a desk and you're sitting quite centrally, you'll have a kind of cone in the middle of the screen. So dark shades other than black, it doesn't affect the black itself, but very dark shades which are a bit lighter than black, they appear darker centrally. They appear quite masked and blended together in a kind of black mass in the middle of the screen, or dark mass, and you do lose some details and dark areas because of that. So my website has a little sort of mesh texture for the header, and to my eye I can see that it's more blended around the PC Monitor's logo in the center of the screen, and it gets increasingly more visible further out. That isn't something that's always picked up by the camera or in videos, it's quite difficult to show. Another way of showing this, lagom.nl, the black levels test there. The visibility of the shades, you can probably see it most clearly on the second block down. Again, this isn't represented as you actually see it firsthand, but you can hopefully see a relative change. So centrally, things appear more masked than they do, and these same blocks shown further out. So again, focus on that second row here. You can see very good visibility, whereas towards the center, they become far more masked. And again, further out the other way, I realise the camera does compensate for the brightness a bit, so it's not very clear, but you can see a difference, hopefully. And I'll give you some in-game examples as well and talk about this, and obviously focus on the strengths of the contrast performance, because there's lots of praise to be given for the contrast performance of this monitor as well. But black crush is quite a technical thing, and it does help to sort of give some out-of-game examples for this as well to try and explain what it does. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about contrast performance using some in-game examples. So the monitor with a VA panel, generally the main strength of the VA panel is strong contrast. And in this case, that's very much true. The contrast of VA panels, though, it still varies between different models and certainly different panels. And in this case, the static contrast, it's specified as 3000 to 1, but I actually measured closer to 3500 to 1, even following the adjustments made to my test settings, a little bit more than that, depending on the settings used on the monitor. But essentially it gives a good depth, a good atmosphere to games like this, where there are plenty of dark scenes, dimly lit interiors and that kind of thing. So it really does give a pleasant atmosphere to this kind of content, certainly compared to what you get on panels with lower static contrast. So the dark areas here, there are plenty of dark shades here, lots of dimly lit areas on this particular scene, and they appear fairly deep. whereas the bright elements such as the fire there really stand out very nicely. And on the video it'll just appear like a big ball of light, but in practice the monitor does display things appropriately in terms of the gradient of a brighter shade, so it doesn't just look like a big ball of light in reality. There's also VA glow to mention. Now you'll be able to see on the video there's a sort of a lightening, a kind of haze towards the bottom. That's greatly exaggerated on the video. In practice it's not as noticeable as it is on the video, but this is VA glow, and this is something which affects all VA models to various degrees. This one has a fairly low amount of this really. I've certainly seen a lot more on other VA panels, and it's not something which really affects the atmosphere much. And as I said, it is exaggerated on the video, so you can kind of see it from a normal viewing position more towards the bottom of the screen. And I've got the camera mounted in such a way that sort of represents an ergonomically correct viewing position if you're at the desk using the monitor. And that means that your eyes are sort of in line with the top third of the screen. So you do tend to see this VA glow a bit more towards the bottom, not so much towards the top, or not at all really towards the top. But I do have to stress it is exaggerated in the video, and compared to IPS glow, it's really a very minor feature. And compared to the VA glow on some VA models, it's also a minor feature. The black crush I mentioned before, that does eat away at some of the subtle detail. So the dark area here, for example, the details there are masked by the VA glow. The perceived gamma is much higher. This is sort of in the middle of the screen at the moment. Things are more masked, more blended together than they should be. But if you view the same content towards the edge of the screen, you can see the visibility significantly increases. Now, of course, games have their own lighting effects and stuff, and this kind of upsets how things look a bit. But I've certainly observed other examples, and if you just sort of strafe, you can see the same thing, although it's a bit harder to show you on the video. So that's Black Crush in action. I wouldn't say it really detracts too much from the experience for me. It is very subjective, but personally I find the atmosphere that this monitor gives on this game appropriate and much better than other panel types give you. Again, with the Black Crush, something to be aware of is that the visibility towards the edge of the screen is actually greater than it should be. So towards the middle of the screen, less visibility than there should be. Towards the edge of the screen, more visibility. And this means that there is some unintended detail on games that can give you a slightly blocky appearance in places just towards the edge of the screen, but it's not extreme. And it does mean that in movies where there are compression artifacts, particularly streamed content, streamed video content, you get these compression artifacts. They should be quite blended and not really very visible, so you don't really notice them. But towards the edge of the screen, it can bring these out a bit because of the perceived gamma being a bit too low. But compared to what you get on a TN model, towards the bottom of the screen where perceived gamma is far too low, this is really a more subtle effect. It's also dependent on your viewing distance. So as I mentioned earlier, I tend to sit around 70 centimeters from the monitor. If you're sitting closer, that exaggerates the effect. If you're sitting further away, and of course this is a console gaming monitor in terms of the marketing at least, so perhaps you would be sitting a bit further away in a more relaxed posture. Perhaps you'd be on a sofa or something like that, sitting back a bit. The effect diminishes and actually the gamma is quite even. So I'm probably sitting around, I'm over a meter away now. So the shifts in gamma, really you can't see them from this kind of position. But if you move your head, or you move your position so you're sitting a bit off to the side in particular, this effect is really quite strong. For the brighter content, it does stand out nicely against darker backgrounds, but the screen surface does give a bit of graininess, a grainy look to these lighter shades. It's something I'm sensitive to, it's something I always comment on in my videos. I didn't actually comment on it. I usually comment on it pretty much at the start of the video actually. I didn't in this case, although I did sort of mention it when I was talking about the external features of the monitor. It's something I'm sensitive to. This monitor is a bit grainy than I'd like the screen surface, so it does impart a bit of graininess to lighter shades such as the sky up there, for example, and the fire there. You won't be able to see this in the video, but it is something that if you are sensitive to graininess and you know you dislike graininess on monitors, you've noticed it before, be aware of it. It is a bit grainy, but it's not awful. It's not sort of a heavy smeary graininess like you can see on some models. Moving on now to the colour reproduction of the monitor. As usual, I like to start off with Lagom, that's lagom.nl, and the tests for viewing angles. I was actually thinking the other day, what would I do if this website didn't exist? Because I do use it in my reviews quite a lot, and I really do find it useful for highlighting certain things. I think I'd be pretty upset, to be honest. I'd probably have to create my own tests or try to find something else, but really this is quite a unique website. I find it really useful, particularly for the viewing angles and colour reproduction. So the test itself, the Lagom text, it's supposed to look a blended grey throughout. On this model, from a sort of normal viewing position, at a desk that is, you get a kind of cone in the middle, which is more blended than the rest of the screen. If you think back to the black crush I was talking about earlier, it's the same kind of thing. So this appears a more blended grey. There's a bit of a red tint to the striping, but further out there's more of a red tint and a sort of an orange tint towards the very edges of the screen, towards the corners. And this cone of more blended appearance of the text, that shifts along with head movement. So again, it's much like that kind of black crush. The same sort of perceived gamma shifts are being observed here. So the purple block here appears a bluish purple centrally, but there is plenty of pink, a sort of a pink tint, and that's stronger towards the edges of the screen. If you're sitting closer, the effect is exaggerated and the pink hue is really strong towards the edges of the screen. If you sit further back, this diminishes and it becomes more even, slightly bluish purple, a bit of a pink towards the edge, unless you go really far back, I suppose. But from normal viewing position, you do notice this shift in saturation between sort of bluish purple to pink. And there are kind of areas of greater pink centrally as well. The red block, that appears a bit more consistent, but it does appear more saturated centrally in that kind of cone in the middle of the screen. And this cone again will shift with head movement. So you can see the area there becomes more saturated, or perhaps you'll see, I can see that to my eye, or less saturated. It's kind of more of a pinkish hue, depending on the viewing position. Or if you're just sitting still using the monitor at a desk, you'll just see it lose saturation towards the edges and the bottom of the screen. The green block is pretty consistent really. It's a green chartreuse colour, saturated green chartreuse, and it appears with a slight yellowish tint, but not as strong as on some models because the colour gamut of this one's quite generous. It makes this appear less of a yellowish green. But there is a bit more of a yellowing towards the edges, the bottom of the screen and the side edges from a normal viewing position. If you happen to be sitting lower down, then you kind of get that towards the top instead. The blue block is a good consistent deep blue throughout. There's really nothing to complain about there. I'm now going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. So overall, the colour reproduction is quite vibrant on this monitor and it's varied. The reason for this is that it has a generous colour gamut. I measured 96% of the DCI-P3 colour space, which is the target for HDR. This monitor is HDR capable, so it makes sense to have good DCI-P3 coverage, but most of the time when I'm using the monitor, and I'm using it right now, it's under SDR. So this game is just running SDR, standard dynamic range, and for that kind of content, it's actually designed with the sRGB colour space in mind. So when you've got a monitor like this with a gamut that extends way beyond that, you actually have extra saturation. And this does give a more vibrant look, but it also makes shades appear more saturated than they should, or than the developers intend. It's an even saturation boost. It saturates many shades, so it isn't the same as a digital saturation enhancement. There's a feature in the OSD, I think it's called Game Color, or I might be confusing the name with other models. I do test a lot of monitors, but it boosts the saturation, or perhaps it's just called saturation on this model. Anyway, that's a digital saturation boost. And it's the same as if you increase digital vibrance in the NVIDIA control panel. What this does is it pulls shades towards the edge of the colour gamut without expanding the colour gamut itself. So that increases the saturation of the less saturated shades. It doesn't give you an edge in the most saturated shades. It crushes things together. You lose shade variety. Things look cartoonish and horrible. Whereas on this, with the expanded colour gamut, things look more saturated, but it's more even and you maintain the shade variety. So the fire here, for example, has a very warming orange glow, a red to orange glow. But there are also some good yellow shades, some good more muted orange shades, but they are all more saturated than they should be. So it's very eye-catching and very vibrant, but at least there's still variety there. And the autumnal browns and the golden browns in the background there, really nice. They stand out nicely, quite nice and vibrant. The wood on the rifles here has a bit too much of an orange tint to it because of the colour gamut, and there are other examples of wood in this game that has a natural slight red hue, or it should have a slightly red hue, but the red hue is dragged out a bit because of the generous colour gamut, so it looks a bit more red than it should in places. But I think most users will like this vibrant look. It's something we've become accustomed to with smartphones and laptop screens and TVs actually having quite a wide colour gamut. So it's something that many users do like. Not everyone likes it, and this monitor doesn't actually have an sRGB emulation setting, so you can't restrict the colour gamut when you're gaming and stuff like that. You can of course use a colorimeter if you're using colour aware applications and map things appropriately using that, but games are not colour aware, and without an sRGB emulation setting, I mean, you could reduce the saturation levels a bit using that little slider I was talking about before in the OSD, but that, unfortunately, you reach a point where things look much less saturated than they should for some shades, whereas others remain quite saturated, and it's very difficult to get the balance right, and it's not as good as having an sRGB emulation setting. The other aspect to be aware of, I mentioned before that there are colour shifts and perceived gamma shifts, so further out the shades do lose a moderate amount of saturation. Towards the edge of the screen, you might even be able to see this on the video, those autumnal reds don't look as intense as they do centrally. But these shifts are more subtle than you'd see on a TN model, comparing the top to the bottom of the screen on them. So the perceived gamma is far too low lower down, and things are quite washed out on TN models, especially if anywhere near this kind of size from a normal viewing position. Whereas on this, you don't get it in such an exaggerated fashion, but it is more noticeable than some VA models, particularly the curved ones using the Samsung SVA panel. So I tested the Philips 328E1CA not too long ago, and that model uses a Samsung SVA panel, and the colour consistency is better on that model. So the shifts in saturation aren't as noticeable as they are on this one. But the panel used on this one, it's an inner lux panel. It's the same panel, as far as I'm aware, that's used on all current flat 60Hz 31.5 inch 4K VA panels. That's quite a mouthful, but basically the BenQ have some, LG have some, Philips have some, and I've actually tested some of them, such as their 32-inch Momentum, the 31.5-inch Momentum model, the 326, and that uses the same panel, or very, very similar panel. Perhaps the backlighting is slightly different. Difficult to say, but basically it's based on the same panel, and they all exhibit the same kind of colour shift behaviour. And as with the Lagom shifts, they just show them more clearly because it's a single individual shade. If you're sitting further out, then these shifts diminish, and actually things look pretty consistent when you're sort of over a metre away and you're sitting quite centrally. And a bit above or below, you can get away with that as well. So if you are sitting back a bit, gaming on a couch, of course this is a console gaming monitor, so that would make sense for some users, then you're going to get a pretty decent experience in terms of the colours. They're going to look pretty vibrant throughout, and you're not going to get that kind of shift. Although if you move your head even slightly, you do get a bit of shifting even from a distance. And if you are sitting too far to the sides, then things look quite sort of washed out really. So if you have a big group of friends, you're really popular, and you're sitting centrally, you might get an awesome experience, but your mates might be not getting the same kind of rich colours because they're sitting to the side of you. That's really all there is to say about the colour reproduction. Overall, pretty vibrant, pretty varied. There are some shifts to be aware of. I'm now running the game under HDR, High Dynamic Range. This monitor supports VESA Display HDR 600. It's VESA Display HDR 600 certified. This is a kind of medium level of HDR performance, and it does bring some definite enhancements compared to lower HDR specifications. So the monitor is able to respond to HDR content, HDR10 content, such as the game I'm running at the moment, Battlefield 5. So what I've done here is I've enabled HDR in the game. The monitor switches to its HDR operating mode, and you will notice if I go into the OSD that you can't access most of the settings. Most of the things are greyed out, so you can't control things like the brightness, you can't control the sharpness. You can set the OD, the overdrive level, you can enable or disable FreeSync, adaptive sync, and there is vivid pixel, which is a sort of sharpness boost, sharpness enhancement, but that's set to 0 by default, which is the lowest level. So I mention this because HDR is really designed to bring close coordination between the GPU and the monitor and have things displayed a certain way that the game developers like, with a bit of artistic license from ASUS themselves. So really, there is one setting you should focus on when you're under HDR, or can focus on, and that is HDR, very appropriately named. There are two different operating modes, ASUS Cinema HDR and ASUS Gaming HDR. Gaming HDR is the default, Cinema HDR is slightly different, and I'll talk a little bit about the differences between these shortly, but I do prefer the Gaming HDR setting, just slightly, and that's what I'm using at the moment. With both settings, you will notice that there is an enhanced sharpness. You might not see this in the video, but things look sharper. That's because there's a sharpness filter added to HDR. That's very common. I've seen that on lots of HDR monitors. It's not unique to this one at all. And it's sort of to accentuate some of the enhancements to the tone mapping and the contrast. And I'll talk a little bit more about these enhancements shortly, or the improvements to contrast and tone mapping, because that's really what HDR is all about, or a lot of what it's about. The other aspect, of course, is the colour gamut. As I mentioned, good DCI-P3 coverage on this one, and things are mapped more appropriately now. And the target gamut is actually DCI-P3 rather than sRGB now under HDR. What that means is that you get a bit of an edge taken off the saturation, so things look a bit more natural. The fire there, for example, has the yellows look a bit more yellow and the oranges look more orange, and there's a little bit of an edge taken off the sort of fiery reddish oranges. The autumnal colours look a bit more muted, but they still look very vibrant overall, and the wood effects and the wooden tones are toned down a bit so they look more neutral. ASUS do actually inject a little bit of extra vibrancy, so things aren't as muted as they look on some HDR models, including the Philips Momentum I mentioned before, which is very similar to this model, but Philips go for a slightly more natural look, and sort of a more as the developers intend look. The issue with that, or the potential issue really, is that I did mention that shades lose a bit of saturation further out. With how ASUS does things here, it actually counteracts those saturation losses a bit, so things look a bit more saturated than they should centrally. Further out, they kind of look more appropriate really, but you still get lots of vibrant elements. Like I said, the fires there, they're showing shades which are way beyond sRGB, far more saturated. So really it's about the palette of colours and the range of colours under HDR. And there are some painted elements. This isn't really the best example, but there are some brightly painted elements elsewhere which really stand out, and they again use shades which are way beyond the sRGB colour space. So it's really about the environments looking varied but natural, and the areas of the game which the developers want to look vibrant do look vibrant. The other aspect of HDR which is important is tone mapping. So this monitor supports 10-bit colour reproduction under HDR. There is a caveat to that, and that is that via HDMI, so if you're using this for console gaming, or you happen to be using HDMI as a PC user, it doesn't actually support 10 bits, it supports 8 bits, but don't worry about that. The system itself fills in the gaps very effectively, so the GPU or the system will be filling out the gaps and using a 2-bit dithering stage on top. And I've compared the two signal types on this monitor and also various others, and honestly the difference between the two is so slight most users aren't going to notice. I didn't have the luxury of a side-by-side comparison. I don't have two of these monitors, I don't have them side by side running different signals, but I did flick between them and observe various different things, and really the end result is very similar, so don't stress about that. And what I'm showing you here, although it's a PC game, it's very much applicable to other content under HDR. That includes movies, that includes console game content. This title does support HDR well, and it shows off really the weaknesses and the strengths of the monitor itself very well. So something which I really notice under HDR is that the bright elements, such as the sky up there, has an intensity which is way beyond what you get under SDR. And that's because the monitor has local dimming and also has a boost in the luminance levels under HDR. So it has 8 LED clusters running down the left side, 8 running down the right side, and a light guide is used to split the monitor into 16 dimming zones. You can have some of those zones very bright and some much dimmer. and that means that these bright elements such as the sky up there stands out really nicely, whereas the darker elements such as the vehicle there looks far more muted by comparison, more dim, and that really does bring a nice dynamic range, which is of course what HDR is all about. And the overall brightness for the brighter elements, really well beyond what you get under SDR, and the fact that it's not just global dimming means that the bright elements do stand out quite nicely, and it gives the daylight scenes a nice natural look. I'm going to talk a bit more about this using Tomb Raider as an example. Another aspect, the 10-bit colour reproduction, this is something which applies regardless of whether you're using local dimming or the monitor supports local dimming, and that is that there's a more nuanced variety of shades, a better subtle shade variety. So the dark area of the undercarriage of the vehicle here, for example, has a really nice variety of shades, and as with a lot of what I'm talking about here, you can't appreciate this on the video, I'm afraid, but in person you do see a really nice nuanced shade variety, and it gives things a more natural look. It also overcomes some of that black rush I was talking about before. And the brighter shades there as well, it's not just a big ball of light as you'd probably see on the video, but there's actually a nuanced variety of shades there, a really nice gradient of bright to very bright shades there. And another thing that this cutscene's really reminded me of is that the skin tones under HDR are certainly more appropriate overall. So Laura's skin tone, it appears more muted. Under SDR, she doesn't quite appear sunburnt, but she appears to have too much of a sun tan, I'd say. Under HDR, more muted. Again, if you compare the skin tones displayed quite centrally in the screen versus further out, there are some shifts, at least if you're sitting at a desk using the monitor. So just a few little things that really sort of came to my mind whilst I was watching this really boring long cutscene. So I'm now just about at the stage where I can actually interact with the character and talk about what I wanted to talk about. Although I would say that these cutscenes are actually a bit more enjoyable under HDR. They do actually look quite a bit better. You might also notice a flickering. That's not specific to this monitor, but this thatched roof, it's sort of a mesh of shades, which are medium shades and darker shades together. And this does cause VA models like this to exhibit a bit of flickering, and it's more noticeable under HDR because the luminance levels are higher. And it's a kind of a brightness change which causes it. It's related to the response behavior, and I mean, I'm going to talk about responsiveness more shortly, but this is something which did really catch my eye on this scene. If you have quick movement, it kind of goes away, things just sort of blur together, but it's just slight movement, it causes a flickering effect, and you can see or hopefully see it's not actually across the whole screen, it just affects certain shades. Just something to be aware of, and it's not unique to this model, it's something which I frequently observe on VA monitors more broadly. Now, what I was actually wanting to talk to you about, so this scene has plenty of really dark elements, so the dark passageway here, and it doesn't actually look as atmospheric under HDR as you might like. And that's because the dimming zones, there's only 16 of them, it's a 32-inch or 31.5-inch screen, and some of the dimming zones are having to display quite bright content, and that's not just pure black either, there's like a mixture of brighter and darker shades, and it can actually see a spotlighting effect in some of the dimming zones. It's exaggerated a bit by the camera, but I can still see it in this dark room here. I can see this spotlighting effect. And really the atmosphere of these dark scenes, these predominantly dark areas, is not what it could be. It isn't as good as it is under SDR. And unfortunately, this is just a limitation of having 16 dimming zones. You need a much greater number of dimming zones to really get rid of this effect. If you think about monitors with lower native contrast, IPS type panels, for example, they would show this kind of effect far more strongly, and it would really flood areas a lot, and dark areas would really not have a nice look at all. But on this one, at least the native contrast is a bit stronger, so it helps somewhat, but it can't overcome the limitation of the number of dimming zones. You just don't have that level of precision. But even so, I do still like the overall experience under HDR because the natural look to the daylight scenes is really nice. And even when there's a mixture of darker and lighter shades, the bright elements do stand out really nicely still, and you still get that nice tone mapping, appropriate use of the colour gamut, all of those benefits. So I still like it. And also, you're not necessarily going to be sitting in a dark room as I am now. This monitor has a good ambient lighting feature, and I mentioned that and go through that in the OSD video. You can of course use that under HDR, there's nothing stopping you using this under HDR. It's under System Setup, various different settings. So there's Halo Sync, and what that does is it extends the image basically behind the monitor. So some of the shades contained within the image are brought out with the RGB LEDs and brought out behind the monitor. So it kind of, to me, it's like a distracting flickering, to be honest. I don't actually like it at all. It also doesn't create enough brightness in dark scenes like this in particular to actually do anything about the dark atmosphere. A better alternative though would be to use Aura RGB, and that can give you a much stronger effect. So you can see nice bright cyan there. So the weaknesses are still there, but it does draw the eye away from it, enhances perceived contrast. You don't necessarily have to be using cyan for this, but that's just a good example. And it does actually work pretty effectively, even to my eye, just to get a bit of an edge, but it's still, there's a bit of a lack of depth, and certainly the precision of having a much greater number of dimming zones would still be appreciated. So I've got a bit of daylight in the room now. You can actually see a bit of glare on the screen. This further draws the eye away from these sort of less than amazing dark elements, but you can still appreciate the bright elements. They still stand out nicely relative to the darker elements. And again, you know, you can still see the sort of spotlighting effect, and the depth just isn't as good as it could be. But even so, I still enjoy using HDR, and I still enjoy the HDR experience on this monitor. And it's mainly these brighter daylight scenes. They really do have a natural quality to them that you just don't get under SDR. I like the colour gamut being used appropriately. I like the tone mapping, and I do like the local dimming, what it brings to the image overall. It's not just on games that I enjoy this. I also watch a lot of Netflix HDR content at the moment, and I really enjoy what HDR brings to the experience there. It's much the same in terms of those really dark, gritty, atmospheric scenes. They don't have the depth they could, but the brighter scenes look really nice. And in my view, I mean, it's very subjective, but I feel that overall it's still nice to have HDR enabled. It isn't necessarily something you're going to be wanting to use all the time. It does increase eye fatigue, especially if you're one of those people who likes to sit in a dimmer room and use the monitor. So it is something which can accelerate eye fatigue, and for that reason I don't like to use it constantly, but it really does add a nice element, and I do think that this monitor offers one of the better HDR implementations out there. I'm now running Minesweeper, and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. I'm now on Battlefield 5, much better than Minesweeper for talking about monitor responsiveness. This is a 60Hz monitor. I've got it running at 60 frames a second pretty solidly at the moment, so I'm making the most out of the monitor in terms of the responsiveness. There's an article on the website all about monitor responsiveness, which talks about the factors which affect that, and there's a key concept explored there called perceived blur, which is very important to understand when it comes to understanding what motion will look like on a monitor and how it's affected by not just the pixel responses, but also the movement of your eyes as you track motion on the screen. There's a summary of that in the written review as well, so if you're a bit shorter on time and you're still new to these concepts, definitely check the written review out, the responsiveness section there. The responsiveness section is well worth a look as well, because it has some pursuit photographs, as they're called, which gives a very nice indication of what motion on the monitor looks like. It's difficult to show this on a video because of all the factors I talked about at the start of the video, and it doesn't really give you a very good indication of exactly what the monitor will look like, but it does help me highlight some weaknesses. So in terms of perceived blur, it's mainly the movement of your eyes as you track motion on the screen which causes this. 60Hz monitor has a lot of perceived blur due to eye movement, certainly compared to high refresh rate monitors. So you're always going to get a moderate amount of perceived blur, no matter how fast the pixel responses are. But slower than optimal pixel responses can increase the perceived blur, they can add trailing, there can be other issues. And I will talk about some of them because this is a VA model, that is to say it uses a vertical alignment panel. And as usual, there are some weaknesses there. But for most of the transitions, especially those when you're out in the daylight and scenes like this, there are lots of brighter shades, some medium shades, and a few darker shades. So most of these are actually performed nice and quickly, and the monitor doesn't really add any perceived blur on top of what you'd see on even the fastest 60Hz monitors. But there are some standout weaknesses in places, and this applies to some extent on all VA models. And that's where you've got your darker pixel transitions. So you can see there's a sort of, you can see the darker area of brickwork there. There's a bit of I wouldn't call it smeary for this particular transition, but it's perhaps what I'd call a heavy powdery trail. You can see it also just to the left of where my iron sights are at the moment. So it does add a bit to the perceived blur where these darker shades exist. And I'll show you some clearer examples of that where really these darker shades dominate. But the reason I like to start with this instead is to show you that actually for the most part the pixel responses are quite decent on this model. The monitor has adjustable OD, overdrive. The setting that I like to use is level 2. That's actually reduced from the factory default, which is level 3. And the reason for that is that it doesn't really slow down the pixel responses very much. There are weaknesses which exist with both settings, but the third setting, which is the default, I'll just switch to that now, it introduces more noticeable overshoot. And at times I found this really quite obvious. So there's some good examples here. To the left of the building here, there is obvious dirty trailing, as I call it. So there's overshoot which is darker than the background and the object colour, so it stands out for that reason. I find it rather eye-catching, kind of an inky look to the trailing. It doesn't always come across in the video, I'm afraid, but I can certainly see it to my eye. And that's just one example. There are others, some sort of bright trailing in places which really stands out quite a lot. A bit to the left of the iron sights again there. And you don't really gain enough, in my view, from using this setting. The pixel responses aren't really sped up enough to make any real difference. And if you go further up, so you ramp up the overdrive setting to level 4, things get really quite ugly in terms of overshoot. Hopefully you'll be able to see this on the video because it's really very obvious, strong overshoot. And there's also level 5, an even stronger setting, which really is of no benefit unless you, for some reason, have some strange overshoot fetish and actually really enjoy looking at overshoot, in which case level 5 might be just what you need. So you'll be able to see really obvious bright halo trailing, very colourful, very bright, really not very nice at all. Really strong, dirty, inky trailing there as well. And the weaker settings, I'm not going to bother showing you them, but really they slacken off the pixel responses too much, and you get a lot more of this powdery trailing, you get some smeary trailing in places where it isn't with the faster settings. So again, I find the level 2 the best balanced. So I'll switch back to level 2 and show you some other scenes on this game which capture some of the weaker pixel responses a bit better. I'm now on a different scene and things are a bit darker overall, and there are lots of very dark shades which really present some of the slower pixel transitions, these sluggish pixel transitions, which all VA models struggle with to varying degrees. So the canoes there, just by the shoreline, there's a bit of powdery trailing. It's quite a heavy powdery trailing, has a bit of a smeary appearance. This greatly increases perceived blur. And the rocks there as well, they're dark, and against the sort of medium shades surrounding it, you do get an elevated level of perceived blur and what some people would call a smeary trail. You get the same with the flag there. And as I said, really, all VA models have various weaknesses to some degree. This one is actually not too bad. It's similar to other flat 60Hz VA models of this resolution, and that's because they all use a variant of the same panel. There's a little bit of overshoot, a little bit of bright halo trailing around the flag post and the tree there as well, but I don't find that particularly eye-catching. I'm around 60 frames a second. I'll come on to what happens when the frame rate reduces a bit further, but with some VA models, the sort of smeary effect to the trailing, the heavy powdery trailing, it would be more extensive, so it would extend way further out and it would create a kind of smoke-like appearance. This one fortunately isn't like that, but it is a bit weaker than the Philips 328 E1CA, which I reviewed not long ago, and that uses a curved Samsung SVA panel. But this is really very similar to the Philips Momentum, the 32-inch or 31.5-inch Philips Momentum, which uses the same panel, or a very close variant of the panel. So really, there aren't any massive weaknesses, but there definitely are some weaknesses. And yes, it will turn some users off. these weaknesses, but you know, it is what it is. They're not everywhere, thankfully. They're just for these darker transitions. You can see sort of a bit of a smeary quality around the book there on the table as well. So again, some transitions which this model struggles with. And where it says E to pick up a letter, you get the same thing there. Very bright transition with some much darker shades in the background. So certainly this does increase perceived blur overall, and there's some heavy powdery trailing around the pots there. I mean, I think you get the idea. Some imperfections, you expect some imperfections on any VA model, or you certainly should. And it's not the strongest VA model out there. Actually, speaking of momentum models, Philips momentum models, the 43-inch momentum is probably one of the strongest 60Hz performers I've used of the panel type in terms of responsiveness, and that does have fewer weaknesses than this one. But as I said, the flat inner lux panels, the 31.5-inch 60Hz VA models, which are very common. BenQ have models that use that, LG have models that use that, Philips, some others. They all share these kind of weaknesses. And at least the overdrive, the OD setting on this is nice and flexible, so I was able to find a nice balance with level 2, as I mentioned before. It would help if I went into the right section of the menu here. I'm not going to show you the lower ones because they just create a real mess of smeary trailing, but level 3, the default, some users may prefer this. It does cut down a little bit on some of that sort of smeary trailing, but it replaces it with overshoot, which I find quite eye-catching. And the overshoot around the tree there, the halo trailing I mentioned before, is now more noticeable, more eye-catching. You also get some fairly obvious dirty trailing around the light there. And the canoes here and some of the really slow pixel transitions with the kind of smeary look to the trailing actually just remains much as it was. A bit of overshoot around the flag post there. So it kind of depends on your preference for overshoot versus some slightly slower than optimal pixel transitions, but you're always going to get some which are slower than optimal anyway. And for that reason, I just prefer level 2. So I'll switch back to level 2 and I'll talk about another area of responsiveness, and that is adaptive sync and the variable refresh rate technologies of this model. This monitor features adaptive sync, which you can leverage via HDMI or via DisplayPort. And that means as an AMD GPU or system user, you can use AMD FreeSync. And as an NVIDIA GPU user, you can use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. And that's what I'm actually using at the moment. I've got an NVIDIA GTX 1080 Ti in the system right now. Overall, the experience is quite similar between the two. And what it does is it ensures that the monitor is able to adjust its refresh rate dynamically to match the frame rate of the content where possible. And it will do that between 40 and 60 Hz, 40 and 60 frames a second. There are some slight differences which I'll come on to between the NVIDIA and AMD implementations on this model. I've increased the graphics settings. I've also got the integrated FPS counter, which displays the refresh rate that the monitor is currently running at. And you'll see that's fluctuating to match the frame rate of the game, which is towards the top right there. Without adaptive sync enabled, this would give you obvious tearing if you had VSync disabled, or it would give you obvious stuttering if you had VSync enabled. Personally, I'm really sensitive to tearing and stuttering from frame rate and refresh rate mismatches, so I really enjoy having this technology active. It's very helpful. It really makes the experience flow better. But you do still notice the drop in frame rate, so it's around 50 frames a second. There are fluctuations either side of that, but compared to a nice solid 60 frames a second or very close to that, I do notice a drop off in connected feel, and that describes how it feels to actually interact with your character on the game world, sort of the precision and the level of fluidity there, and also increases the perceived blur. So it is nicer having a high frame rate, but it's also very nice having a lack of tearing and stuttering from mismatches between the two. Something to be aware of is that the overshoot I'd mentioned before wasn't really very strong at 60 frames a second. As the refresh rate reduces, the overshoot becomes stronger, more noticeable. You could reduce the OD setting to be really sensitive to overshoot and you're frequently well below 60 frames a second, but if you do that, you do get some much slower than optimal pixel responses, and you do get an increase of perceived blur overall. So I think level 2 remains quite nicely balanced. If you increase this to level 3, the overshoot intensifies further. So again, I really do think that the level 2 is the best setting, but people will make up their own minds about that. The overshoot's not extreme at this kind of level, but it is more noticeable during these drops. And this is something where G-Sync models with an actual G-Sync module improve on things. They use variable overdrive, so it retunes your overdrive as the refresh rate changes, so it slackens things off as the refresh rate drops, and that keeps this overshoot at bay. But adaptive sync models like this, they don't use that. So really it's just tuned for 60 Hz, and as the refresh rate drops because your frame rate's dropping and you've got adaptive sync enabled, it does increase the overshoot levels. This isn't something you'd notice if you had adaptive sync disabled, but of course you'd get tearing and stuttering, which, to be fair, I think most users would despise more than this slight increase in overshoot. I've ramped up the graphics settings further, and it now drops to about 40 frames a second. Perhaps it sometimes goes a little bit below that, perhaps not in this scene, but again the connected feel is worse. Overshoot levels are increased further, although I wouldn't say it's extreme overshoot. It's more noticeable but not super eye-catching, and sensitivity to that does vary. Some people won't really notice this, but the lack of tearing and stuttering is very nice. So if you drop below 40 frames a second, then the technology simply deactivates, and then you get the tearing and stuttering returning. And as I mentioned, there's a slight difference between the implementation with AMD FreeSync versus NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode on this monitor, and that happens if you get very close to the floor of operation. There's a little bit of flickering. You won't be able to see it clearly, or you might not be able to see it clearly here, because it's quite subtle unless you have HDR active, and then it becomes more noticeable. And I'll just show you a quick clip which shows the monitor running HDR. I'm using NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode, and it compares the experience around sort of 50 frames a second plus to where it drops below 44 frames a second or 45 frames a second, and that you then get some quite intense flickering. And I also noticed this when it dropped below the floor of operation and the technology deactivated, at least with HDR enabled. And because of the high luminance levels of HDR, and perhaps the extra voltage required, I did find the flickering really quite noticeable under HDR. But I would mention that this is still an improvement over the Philips Momentum model, which uses a similar panel and has a similar feature set. And that's because that model, if you had HDR and NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode active at the same time, it gave intense flickering at anything below 60 frames a second. So as soon as you were in the variable refresh rate range, super flickering, really distracting and annoying. So this one is at least usable. With my NVIDIA GTX 1080 Ti, to be honest, I'm quite rarely below 45 frames a second, so I can quite happily use HDR and adaptive sync at the same time. And just before ending this section, I do have to mention input lag, because I completely forgot to mention that before, sorry about that. I measured a little bit under 9 milliseconds, so it's not super low, but it's lower than most TVs, and it's really at a level that most users will be quite comfortable with. To wrap up then, I think I'd start by talking about the RGB LED lighting feature, because it's pretty difficult to ignore in this section of the video, because I've got it doing this little rainbow cycle effect. I did like this feature. I don't really care for the rainbow cycling effect in general. I don't really care for the halo sync feature either, but it is worth a mention, and that's because it creates a really nice strong field of light around and behind the monitor. It is effective, and you can use that with a static colour. So, for example, cyan or red, yellow, whatever you fancy. If you can get the software to work, you can customize that further. And I did find it useful for enhancing perceived contrast. So it was a nice little feature, well implemented on this monitor. The stand base, I'm not too fussed about the pads there, because I'm not a console gamer, I don't need to charge things on that. I use Qi wireless charging for my phone, so I don't have any utility in that respect either. The matte black plastics, I'm happy enough for that. I don't like glossy plastics very much, so the use of matte black plastics I'm quite happy with. I think it's worth mentioning the speakers as well, because they're very good. They're the best I've actually heard on a monitor before. Very useful, very usable. and nice when I wanted to rest from my headphones. Or if I was playing music and it wasn't going to be obnoxious to others in the room, or I was gaming, stuff like that, I did sometimes use the speakers. Not great for directional audio, you know, a nice pair of headphones with a good surround effect. They can be much nicer for that kind of thing, but the quality of the speakers, really very good. The contrast performance of the monitor, the static contrast, really strong. As I mentioned, the perceived contrast can be enhanced by this lighting feature, especially if you're in a dimmer room, but regardless of that, it had a good base of strong static contrast, measured around 3500 to 1, really stronger than many other panels and even some VA panels, so that was good. A moderate amount of black crush and some fair shifts in perceived gamma. In that respect, it was weaker than the curved Samsung SVA alternative, which I'd seen in the Philips 328E1CA recently. So the Samsung model is better in terms of its gamma consistency, lower black crush, but even so, I don't really find that detracts from the atmosphere too much, and the static contrast of this one is actually a bit stronger than those curved Samsung SVA panels. The screen surface I didn't find particularly agreeable, but that's something I'm quite fussy about. Some users aren't going to really care about this, and it wasn't super grainy or horrible. It didn't make me want to scratch my eyes out or anything like that. VA glow as well. It's always worth mentioning that VA panels do have a bit of VA glow. It's not as intense as IPS glow, but some VA models have more than others. On this one, it was really a very minor feature. The overall contrast performance, the overriding thing that I got from that was really a nice strong static contrast performance. I'd mentioned those gamma shifts. It does affect the colours as well, the colour reproduction, because shades did lose a moderate amount of saturation towards the edge and bottom of the screen from a normal viewing position. And by normal viewing position, I'm talking about sitting at a desk here from around 70 centimetres, a little bit further away as well. But if you're sitting on a sofa, some distance, sort of above a metre away from the monitor, you won't actually notice these shifts, and unless you are sitting to the side of the monitor, and then these shifts become quite extreme and things look quite flooded. So it might be that you get a nice view, but your mates next to you on your couch might not get such a nice view, so just be aware of these shifts. And all VA panels have them to some extent, but again, the curved alternative to this panel is a bit stronger in that respect. In spite of this, the overall colours are vibrant, good vibrant colour output. I'll just change the wallpaper. I was getting a little bit sick of seeing that tiger, beautiful though it was. So nice vibrant colour output overall. As I mentioned before, some losses of saturation towards the edges, but still the colour gamut really invites a nice amount of vibrancy. Good coverage of the DCI-P3 colour space, well above sRGB. So that means that sRGB content, and that's most content you'll be looking at in games or when you're just browsing the internet, that kind of thing, does look more saturated than the developers or creators will have intended. Some people really do like that look, and we're quite used to that look. It's something we get from TVs and smartphones these days as well. But this monitor doesn't offer an sRGB emulation setting. So unless you've got an AMD graphics card, or you're using color-aware applications and you can actually profile the monitor, it does mean that it's something you're kind of stuck with, and you can't just flick a switch on the monitor in the OSD and have it switch to the sRGB mode with the more restricted gamut. The responsiveness of the monitor, never something that VA models are amazing at, and this one was really no exception, but it wasn't awful. It was sort of, I'd say, kind of middling for a VA panel really, and it's really very similar to other monitors which use this panel or a variant of the panel. But this did have a good flexible overdrive setting, so it's nice to be able to tune that according to your tastes, but you are left with some standout weaknesses, a bit of smeary trailing in places, heavy powdery trailing, but overall not an awful experience for the panel type. Input lag, moderately low, fairly low, not super low, lower than most TVs, and as it's a 60Hz monitor, sort of a level which most users will be quite happy with. The reason I mention 60Hz is because personally I would find this level of input lag, just a bit under 9 milliseconds, noticeable on a high refresh rate monitor, but on a 60Hz monitor like this, personally I don't really find it detracts from the connected feel. It's not something that bothers me, and I think it's fair to say for most users it's not going to be a problem. It's low enough. Adaptive sync worked nicely, did its thing, worked with both my AMD and Nvidia GPU, and it would work over HDMI as well, so that's good for console users. I realised the review was rather PC heavy, but as I mentioned at the start of the review, games consoles, modern games consoles, very similar to modern PCs really. It's just really a mid-range PC. So in terms of the monitor's feature set, you can use it in much the same way, and the performance of the monitor is much the same. HDR is really a big box ticked for this monitor in my book. It offers a nice HDR experience, VESA Display HDR 600 compatible, has 10-bit color reproduction supported. Whether that's using the GPU or monitor depends on how you've got it connected up, whether you're using HDMI or DisplayPort. But either way, it uses 10-bit color processing, and it really does enhance the tone mapping, so you get a nicer variety of nuanced shades. It puts that wide color gamut to good use. And the way that ASUS implements the HDR feature, it's a bit different to how Philips did it. So it gives you a little bit of a more saturated look, but it still tones down the saturation compared to SDR, and it gives, in my opinion, a rather natural look with a bit of extra vibrancy. And this is really a level of vibrancy which most users, I think, will be quite comfortable with. And there are certainly plenty of shades well beyond what you'd see with an sRGB gamut, much closer to your DCI-P3 boundaries there. But it still takes an edge off some of the oversaturation you get under SDR, so I think it works nicely. And as I'd mentioned, a bit of a loss of saturation towards the edges, and if anything, this slight boost in saturation under HDR compared to the more natural HDR look, if you want to call it that the Philips alternative uses, that actually helps the shades look a bit more saturated towards the edges versus looking sort of correct towards the center, then getting a bit washed out, if that makes sense. Another important aspect of the HDR performance is contrast. This monitor has a good peak luminance, around 700 candela per meter squared, so actually a little bit above the VESA Display HDR 600 requirements there. It also has local dimming, 16 dimming zones, so not a huge number of dimming zones, so it's not perfect in that respect, but it does allow it to make some elements of the scene really bright, whilst others are dimmer than they otherwise would be if it was just using global dimming. And I actually quite liked the overall effect that gave. So for brighter scenes, it gave a nice natural look to the image, sort of a natural daylight quality, if you like. But for darker scenes, it didn't really give the depth that you might like. So it didn't really look as atmospheric and as deep as it could. And if you compare it to the look you get under SDR, not really as good in that respect. However, the lighting feature does help in this respect. Again, it enhances the perceived contrast. So if you've got that acting as a bias light behind the monitor, it does help. If you're in a well-lit room, again, the perceived contrast is enhanced and you don't really notice the weaknesses so much. But even so, it would have been nicer to have a greater number of dimming zones. But then you have to really consider which alternative to this monitor offers that. And you're really looking at no direct competitor at the moment, which does. The FALD, full array local dimming solutions, it adds a huge amount of cost to the monitor. And even then, you can have other issues such as haloing and that kind of thing. So it's a bit of a compromise, but there's always a bit of a compromise. And compared to your sort of baseline VESA Display HDR 400 level performance, the HDR performance of this model is really very nice. So overall, I found the colour reproduction a little bit lacking compared to the curved alternatives to this, but still quite vibrant overall. The contrast performance, in terms of the static contrast, nice and strong. Some weaknesses associated with contrast, but really this is just me being picky. Most users would really enjoy the overall image experience that this gives. Responsiveness, again, kind of middling for the panel type, not amazing, not awful. So again, most users I think would find it quite decent. The HDR performance, it really is head and shoulders above most models, but not perfect. So always a mixed bag with monitors. I'm really very thorough and usually quite critical when I'm reviewing monitors. So just be aware of that. If I say I don't like something, it doesn't mean you're not going to like it. And this monitor, I did enjoy using it. So that's really all there is to the ASUS CG32UQ. Be sure to check out the full review on pcmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.